So if we sort of take a step back and look what's happened in recent history, obviously we had our own independence referendum in 2014, where by a margin of 55% to 45%, we voted to stay in the UK. And at that point, the UK, although we sort of knew by that point that we may be heading for a referendum about European Union membership, we were very much still in the European Union. But so we voted to stay in the UK. Fast forward about 18 months, nearly 2 years, and obviously we had in June 2016, we had the referendum about the UK's membership of the European Union, and we voted to come out of the European Union as the UK. Now, the problem with some of that is that when you look at voting patterns in Scotland, actually we voted in Scotland very much to stay in the European Union by almost a factor of 2 to 1. So 62% of us voted to stay in the European Union, and 38% of us voted to come out. So, in other words, as the politicians would say, we are being dragged out of the EU against our will and against the express wishes of the people of Scotland. So that's the background to it. That, the democratic outrage, as the First Minister would say, and there is kind of good reason for that, I think. And I think what she calculated was that because almost 2/3 of us had voted to stay in the European Union, the fact that we were being dragged out would mean that people would support her call for another independence referendum. But in actual fact, that hasn't happened, and both support for independence hasn't really changed significantly since 2014, and support for a second independence referendum, so for actually holding another referendum, has never been above, in the short term, has never been above 50%. So in other words, I think the government in Scotland sort of miscalculated actually the strength of voters' feelings. So even though I think for a lot of people, well, they don't want to be, that they are being dragged out of the EU against their will, it didn't necessarily mean in their minds that what they wanted as a result of that was another independence referendum. So because of the election that happened this year, and the fact that the SNP lost quite a few, about 21, 22 seats, at least in the short term, there isn't going to be another independence referendum in Scotland.
Scotland didn't vote for Brexit. It was 62% for Remain, 38%, which was higher than some expected, for Leave, and that was across the whole country. You couldn't point to any council areas where there was a Leave vote, and according to opinion polls, those numbers have gone up a bit to around 66% Remain. So I think the sort of constitutional and political issue of Scotland being very out of sync with English and Welsh politics, at least, is quite an important one. I mean, before the referendum, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said that she felt constitutionally Scotland should have a veto as one of the constituent parts of the UK. And not surprisingly, that wasn't given.
The last sort of 15, 20 years has seen a real sort of political sea change, particularly in Scotland. And I don't think while that is the case, it was a UK referendum and you go by the UK result, in a sense, sort of politically and almost culturally, we have sort of moved on from that now, and you can't expect, while you can try and implement the result as it pertains to the whole of the UK, you can't expect to do that without people in different parts of the UK saying, well, hang on a sec, we didn't vote for this, and whether that's in Wales, whether that's in this case Scotland or Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland at the moment, there is no, as we speak, there is no government, so finding their voice in this is a little bit more difficult. Whereas we in Scotland have a government, we have a strong government. It's been in power for 10 years. It's extremely pro-European. There wasn't a single politician from the SNP, either at Westminster, Holyrood, or in local government, who during the campaign stood for leaving. Now, some of them since the referendum have come out as leavers, but during the referendum not a single SNP politician despite the fact that about a third of SNP voters voted for leave, which is a separate issue. It is unsurprising that the weight of the Scottish government, which is, I think, sort of taken much more seriously these days, was put behind the position of, we really don't want this to happen. This is a democratic outrage. And if we can't stop it happening, then we're jolly well going to try and have our voice heard and make sure that the sort of, as I was saying earlier, the different kind of political and economic conditions in Scotland are taken into account during the negotiation period.
Get more from the Open University. Check out the links on screen now.